So I would like to welcome you all to IAFI's second online event in its COVID series. I'm James Heinz. I'm the chair of the membership committee of IAFI, and I just wanted to make a few announcements about upcoming events. So we have a third online event in the COVID series scheduled for May 22nd. That's a Friday at this time. And it's going to feature Smriti Rao, Jen Cohen, and Luisa Nassif Pires. Radhika Balakrishnan will be the moderator of that. So mark your calendars now for that event on May 22nd. And we're hoping to have several other events in this COVID series, with one hopefully in the first part of June focusing on COVID Voices from the Global South. So just letting you know about those upcoming events. And that's it from me. I'm going to turn it over to Elissa Braunstein, who's going to be moderating the event today.
Thank you, James. So welcome, everyone. It's a great honor to be here and to help mediate this discussion. Maybe most of you saw that yesterday, IAFI issued a statement on universal social provisioning and the pandemic. And in addition to alighting on the fundamental and feminist value of universal social provisioning, it also underscores the importance of macroeconomic capacity and policy in ensuring well-being and social justice, and the central role that international macro policy collaboration has in facilitating access to these tools among countries of all income levels. So I'm thrilled at this moment to be able to introduce this panel on feminist macroeconomics as it relates to COVID-19, and even more so to have it populated by such leading lights in the field, all of whom have served as both model and inspiration to me and many others. So I'm going to introduce each of them in turn. Diane Elson is Emeritus Professor at the University of Essex in the UK, visiting professor at the Women in Scotland's Economy Research Centre at Glasgow Caledonian University, and research associate at the Centre for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers. She served as chair of the UK Women's Budget Group, is a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy, and is a longtime consultant to UN Women, as well as many other international organizations. In 2016, Diane was awarded the Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought for her work on development, gender, power, and human rights. Stephanie Seguino is professor of economics at the University of Vermont in the US, with a long and diverse list of contributions to feminist macroeconomics, much of it emphasizing the impact of inequality on growth, as well as the impact of various aspects of globalization on well-being and intergroup disparity. She too has worked with a long list of international organizations and research groups, including UN Women, UNDP, the ILO, the World Bank. Her work, I think, is the best example I can think of what it looks like to be a stratification economist that does macroeconomic analysis. Jayati Ghosh is a professor of economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi in India, as well as the executive secretary of IDEA's International Development Economics Associates. A globally renowned economist, her dedication to telling the truth about the workings of power and conflict, I think, is a real exemplar of what it means to be a public intellectual. Her specialties include globalization, international finance, macro policy, employment in developing countries, and issues related to gender and development. In 2010, she received the ILO's Decent Work Research Prize. So welcome to all three. Now, at first we thought we'd start with Jayati, but she wisely advised that she should go last in order to highlight the fewer macroeconomic policy choices that developing countries have relative to advanced economies to manage the crisis. So let's begin with Diane.
Thank you. So I'm speaking to you from the UK, which is has the worst record in Europe of deaths from COVID-19, and where the health dimensions of the crisis has been seriously mismanaged. But what I'm going to focus on in my 10 or so minutes is the economic package that's been introduced to try and mitigate some of the impacts of the lockdown that we've been in since the end of March. That's what I'll focus on. So next slide, please. So we've had fiscal policy interventions from Her Majesty's Treasury, which is the quaint name for our Ministry of Finance. We've got additional spending of 4% of GDP, and also off-budget liabilities for loans of 16% of GDP. And these are IMF figures, and it compares with 7% and 4% in the USA, 4% and 30% in Germany. I don't quite understand why in Germany they have such a large off-budget liability worth looking at. And then Korea, which of course has managed the epidemic much better than anywhere in Europe or North America, 2% and 6% of GDP. In the UK, there has been more money for public services, especially health, but a lot of this seems to be going to private sector companies rather than to our existing National Health Service, so we're worried about that. We have a big jobs retention scheme that covers 80% of the pay of furloughed workers for 2 months. So furloughed workers are those where their employer has said, don't come into work for 2 months. We're not making you redundant. You still got your job after 2 months, we hope, but we're applying to the government to pay 80% of your pay. And at the moment, the scheme's just opened and a quarter of UK employees are now on this furlough scheme. So it's quite an expensive scheme in terms of fiscal policy. There's also a self-employed income support scheme. There's the enhancement of existing statutory sick pay support and welfare benefits. There's small business grant schemes, 100% guarantees for commercial loans to small and medium enterprises. The rail companies, which have been hard hit by people not traveling so much on public transport, have been partially renationalized to keep them going. And there are subsidies for bus companies whose revenues have also been hit. And a lot of details on that reference I've put on the slide there. Next slide, please. So what are the sources of finance for this big package? It's primarily a large increase in government borrowing via sales of government bonds denominated in pound sterling. And there's been no problem selling these. There's a big demand as they're seen by investors as much safer than shares at the moment. But borrowing is forecast by the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is an arm's length but publicly funded body, to rise sharply to 14% of GDP, the highest level since the Second World War. I make that comparison because a lot of comparisons keep being made with the Second World War in the context of COVID-19 in the UK. The total government debt is forecast by the OBR to rise sharply to at least 95% of GDP, although that is still far less than in the Second World War. The comparisons are made with the Second World War to argue there's no problem with this because we had much higher rates of debt when it was the Second World War. The fiscal rules that prevailed in 2010, 2019 have abandoned. They said you couldn't possibly borrow to finance current spending, but now they've decided it is okay to borrow to finance current spending. But of course, the UK won't be safe from COVID-19 until more finance is made available to governments in the global south, which I expect Jayati will talk about, but debt cancellation, new issues of special drawing rights from the IMF, etc. Next slide, please. There's also been monetary and financial policy from the Bank of England. The bank rate is being cut from 0.75% to 0.1%. There's been more quantitative easing with additional purchases of government bonds and a special COVID corporate financing facility to buy corporate bonds issued by large firms, which is already benefiting airline and fossil fuel companies, but no conditions are attached to this because it's not a direct subsidy to the companies, it's buying up corporate bonds that they've already issued, but obviously this helps them through the crisis. And we might note that quantitative easing in the past, that was introduced after the financial crisis in 2008, pushed up share values, and that benefited mainly wealthy white men. So there were distributional implications of quantitative easing. There have also been measures to encourage commercial banks to lend more support to business. There's been a reduction of the reserves that commercial banks need to hold. There's long-term low-interest credit for banks that increase lending to small and medium enterprises. But this is a very weak link in the support package because UK commercial banks have usually lent mainly, overwhelmingly for asset purchase, especially property, and they're not very good at lending to support business operations. The overdraft facility at the Bank of England for the government has been extended, a temporary loan, we're told, repaid by the end of the year. But direct monetary financing of the budget deficit has not yet been introduced, but it's very much under discussion among academics who are looking at what's happening at the moment. Next slide, please. So, questions for feminists. What are the questions we've been asking in the UK about this? Are the measures supportive of gender equality or not? Are they sufficient? And there's quite a detailed analysis of this produced by the Women's Budget Group, given the reference there on the slide where it can be found. And I will, in a moment, say a little bit more about the kind of analysis that's been done by the group of the gender dimensions of this package. But then there are also the challenges for the future. When people start to talk about, quote, the need to pay down the debt, what do we say? And are there ways we can advance a feminist approach to macroeconomic policy that does not focus primarily on quick restoration of GDP growth, but focuses on structural change that enables us to build better, more equal, more caring, greener and cleaner economies in the future? Next slide, please. So the Women's Budget Group in the UK has done some analysis of this job retention scheme. First of all, to point out, there's no right for workers to request to be furloughed. That's the decision for the employers, who then have to apply to the government for the finance for it. And we don't have up-to-date unemployment data, unlike the USA. But there's been a big survey that suggests that 15% of those in work are estimated to have lost their jobs due to COVID-19, and 17% of these are women compared to 13% of men. It's hit service industries particularly badly, and it will continue to hit some service industries, the non-essential ones, particularly badly. So this scheme, now there's been pressure from women's organizations about this scheme, and it does now cover workers who cannot report for work because of increased care responsibilities. With the closure of schools and nurseries, families being told you mustn't ask grandparents because they're too vulnerable to the virus, then parents have got a lot more childcare on their hands. So now you can say, I can't come to work because I've got these increased care responsibilities. Please put me on furlough, but it has to be full time. It's not possible for both parents in a two-parent family to be furloughed part-time to look after the kids and to be employed from home, for instance, part-time, or to go into the company and work part-time. And so it's more likely, given the prevailing norms and structures of pay, to be women that take furlough full-time for care, increasing their unpaid work and losing some income. And there is emerging evidence now of women doing more of the extra unpaid work than men. So we're worried that this is going to set back the cause of gender equality. There are also precarious workers who are employees, but they have 0 hours or they're on part-time. And the majority of these are women. And these are more likely to have their hours reduced than to be furloughed. Instead of their employer saying, I'll put you on furlough and apply for the government subsidy, they'll be told, oh, there are no shifts for you this week, or your hours are cut in half this week. We don't have any exact numbers on that yet. So far, this scheme extends to the end of June, but then what? What's going to happen then? And there's a big concern about that. Next slide, please. We also did some analysis of the welfare benefits, which have been enhanced. I mean, we do still have a welfare state of sorts with a lot of holes in it. And we do have statutory sick pay. It's now payable from day 1, not day 5, but it's less, what you get is less than 1/3 of the national living wage. So if you're sick, you think you've got COVID-19, you can't really afford to stay at home if you're a very low income worker, because the sick pay doesn't give you a living wage. And in addition, this is a contributory benefit, and women are 70% of those not eligible for statutory sick pay. And there are also 77% of workers in jobs with a high risk of infection. So a lot of women who would need sick pay are actually not going to get any sick pay. We've got a scheme called Universal Credit, which is the pre-existing non-contributory scheme for those with no income and low savings. And that's been increased by £20 a week and conditionality relaxed. And we're glad to see the increase in the payment and the relax in the conditions. But there are many pre-existing problems with this scheme. And in particular, this scheme makes payment into a single bank account per household. So this increases the risks of financial abuse of women. A benefit that does go on the whole directly to women which is child benefit, which is paid to the main carer. You can choose who the main carer is, but it is predominantly women who get it. That one has not been increased. Next slide, please. So there are more detailed analysis of many of these measures in the report that the Women's Budget Group has produced, but I'll turn to my last 2 points now, the challenges for the future and how we engage with them. Paying down the debt, question mark. The Bank of England could provide monetary financing to limit the amount of new debt. And of course, there are some vocal voices saying this is the way to go. But if used indefinitely, I think it will run the risk of higher inflation, and that will also increase interest rates and debt service. So it's by no means a panacea. We're worried that there'll be future pressure to cut expenditure to pay down the debt, as there was after the financial crisis. And we have to resist the analogy that the government will doubtless make between government debt and credit card debt and say, you know, we've maxed out the credit card again, the national credit card, and so now we have to tighten our belts and spend less. So we have to argue and show people how government debt's not like household debt, and it can be rolled over, and the total can be reduced over a long period. And it can be reduced without expenditure cuts if well-off people and corporations pay more tax, as they used to do in the 50s and 60s. That's how the debt was reduced after the Second World War. Of course, for the Global South, it isn't so simple. And there we have to have an agenda of debt cancellation, new allocation of SDRs, etc. One idea that I read about earlier this week is if rich governments do use monetary financing, they could allocate some of this to a fund for developing countries. But I'm not holding my breath that that will happen. Next slide, please.
Diane, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are over time. So if you could wrap up quickly, that would be great.
Yeah, this is my last one. So it's what can we do for the future to have an equitable, caring, greener growth, so that we don't just talk about restoring growth, but transforming growth, investing in social as well as physical infrastructure, a care New Deal, a Green New Deal, different targets, not just GDP, but a genuine progress indicator, not just full employment, but employment in good jobs, monitoring unemployment and underemployment and precarious work disaggregated by sex, race, and region. Don't just target paid work, target the share of unpaid care work done by men and boys, raise more revenue, especially with wealth taxes, and maybe think about issuing new kinds of bonds, particularly linked to investment in care and investment in green bonds, and conduct gender equality and human rights impact analysis, a regular part of macroeconomic policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane. Okay, now we will switch over to Stephanie Seguino.
Great, am I all set? Great. Thanks, everybody, for being here and those who have organized this. If I could have the next slide. I wanted to, this is the third kind of global crisis that I have been an economist, working as an economist. The first was the Asian financial crisis, the Great Recession of 2008, and now this one. And what is similar to all of them is the fragilities, who bears the burden of crises. And so in many ways, although we're talking about COVID, I think it's important to understand that the crisis itself found a very fragile host. And that is the social and economic fragilities that existed long before COVID and really emerged in the process of globalization. And so I've listed a few things here that you probably all are very aware of. The trends in terms of low wage, insecure jobs with too few benefits, economic insecurity, right? The kind of gig economy and insecure employment, a shredded social safety net. And of course, amongst that is the decline of public health investments, whether in rich countries or induced in poor countries by the IMF conditionality, for example. We have the problem in the United States of mass incarceration as a way to, that exacerbates racial inequality. And we have the problem of monopolization of a variety of industries, the banking industry and others that have led to the growth of inequality, but led to a phenomenon where even in communities such as my own, and this photograph is from my community, I've been photographing during the COVID crisis, Burlington is considered to be a vibrant economy, one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. And so we should be one would think we were in a better position to respond to this crisis, but beneath the surface, in a way that's not visible on a daily basis, but is visible in a photograph like this, people are living lives of quiet desperation. And so this is the host upon which COVID is operating. And I mentioned here also the role of big pharma, which is particularly relevant because its monopolies have really worsened public health. Moreover, currently, even with COVID, monopoly control over technology and patents and so forth has hampered test kit availability as well as some other things. So in my view, understanding the impact of COVID has to understand the pre-existing conditions, and how we respond to this crisis has to take into consideration that we cannot return to the conditions that existed before COVID. Can you advance the slide? Yep, there you go. So just to put some numbers on this and to understand the fractures in terms of race in particular, the 13% you see here was, I think was about 2 weeks ago. More recently, as of April 30th, the increase in unemployed in the United States brings, this is not the official unemployment rate, but it is my estimate of the unemployment rate, which is around 24%. And in the United States, the Black unemployment rate is typically almost double the white unemployment rate. And it's very conceivable that the Black unemployment rate will rise to as much as 40%. Next slide. So let me just say a few words about racial inequality in COVID as a way to understand the impact of inequality across a variety of countries, and just to understand the way that that impacts the United States. There may be, if you might have to click one more time, Julie. There should be another, there we go, okay. So what we're seeing is dramatically higher COVID deaths of people of color, Hispanics especially, and African Americans. And you can see in the upper right corner that in Illinois, for example, Blacks are 14% of the population, but experienced 41% of COVID deaths. In Louisiana, 33% of the population, 70% of the deaths. And so the question is, why is this happening? And again, for all communities that are living with deprivation, what is it that is going on that leads to this? One of the phenomena, of course, is residential segregation and the lack of amenities, the lack of good public health in communities of color, food deserts that have resulted in high rates of chronic disease. And in particular, and again, this is with regard to race, but also for low-income people, the phenomenon of weathering. And that is the accelerated degradation of the body over the lifespan due to the extra effort that is needed to survive, whether it is to survive racism, but also adverse economic conditions. And so in Chicago, for example, we find that Black residents live almost 9 years fewer than white residents as a result of this phenomena. There's also been recent evidence that has linked air pollution exposure to COVID deaths. And we know that this is true in low-income communities, but especially with regard to environmental racism, the situating of toxic industrial plants and so forth. And finally, a study that just came out recently that is of interest to me is that we're also finding that African-American patients are far less likely to be referred for testing than are white patients with the same medical conditions. So my point here is that inequality, COVID is revealing fractures that already existed. And these are some of the trajectories that they can take. Next slide. I'm just going to say a couple of words about gender because many people have talked about it here. And this photograph on the left is in my community as well. It's a woman cleaning houses. This was the first week of the shutdown here. And so we see kind of a bifurcation that on the one hand, women are overrepresented amongst essential workers because they are concentrated in service industries like healthcare and in retail trade and so forth. And on the other hand, they are also disproportionately in those industries that have been shut down as a result of COVID, hotels, restaurants, and so forth. So they've disproportionately lost jobs, and they've disproportionately been called on to do the more dangerous work. In a posting recently, Beena Agarwal had mentioned the phenomenon of nurses who are less likely to get protective gear than are male doctors. When I read that, I did some investigation here at the hospital in Burlington and elsewhere, and I hear similar reports in the United States. So those essential workers who are women who are working also seem to be disproportionately disadvantaged with regard to protections on the job. Next slide. And just a few words here. So the broader phenomenon here is, again, the pre-existing conditions, and in particular, inequality also amongst low-income white people and low-income men. This phenomenon of weathering exists for low-income folks as well, regardless of their race. So for example, while there is a discussion that people over 70 are vulnerable to COVID, people who are low-income and are vulnerable due to the onset of chronic disease, the early onset of chronic diseases, are likely actually to be more susceptible to COVID at a much younger age. Next slide. So I want to just say a few words about the CARES Act, which was the first fiscal package in response to the crisis. A big component of it was the individual expenditures, that $1,200 going to eligible households, for example. There is, notice, $500 billion for big corporations. We might add to that a lot of the small business money that was designated, which nevertheless went to large corporations. you will notice that there's some spending for state and local government, and very little for education, for universities and so forth. But nevertheless, if I could have the next, if you could just click that button. The cost of the program, I think nobody has batted an eyelash at, is $2 trillion, but there will, as Diane mentioned, be backlash soon with regard to deficit spending. And I think it's important to remember the steps that have been taken to put us in a vulnerable financial position, including, for example, the Trump tax cuts of $2.3 trillion, which nobody mentioned at the time as contributing to the deficit. And so our challenge as progressive economists will be to challenge the backlash that comes around debts and deficits, and to remind ourselves of other steps that have been taken that have worsened our condition in a way that does not deal with the inequalities and fractures that already exist. Next slide. So you may know that many people have been left out of the CARES Act. For example, perhaps most egregious is that immigrants, including legal immigrants, are barred from receiving some of the unemployment and benefits, as well as the $1,200 sort of basic income grant, for example. And I know that Jayati will talk about this, but many immigrants send remittances home. And for many countries, remittances are a large share of GDP. So apart from the fact that many of these workers, immigrant workers, are in fact very vulnerable because they are continuing to work because they cannot afford to not work, or they are in service industries, they're particularly vulnerable and they've been left out. There's nothing to address the lack of healthcare coverage. And in my view, one of the major things that has to be done in this process of the social distancing and shutdowns, which you can be likened to an induced coma, right? Essentially, governments have induced economic comas in their economies. And so how do you feed the patient, if you will? And the answer is that you have to supply the patient with nutrition to keep it alive. And so in the absence, in what is being done so far is not enough to help households stay out of debt, whether it's credit card debt. I'm also speaking of small businesses that don't have retained earnings, and that will be a major challenge for us going forward. And of course, there's really not yet much discussion about a higher and continued universal basic income. Next slide. So I want to just go back to this issue of debt, because I think it is one that we as feminist economists can weigh in on a great deal, because we have an understanding that many expenditures are in fact investments themselves that lead to resiliency and productivity growth in the long run. And so we have a different way of analyzing public debts and deficits. But I want to just say a word about the problem of debt buildup, and that is that, and this happened in the last recession as well, that if households do not essentially have a replacement of their income, and if small businesses do not, the recovery will be much slower. With regard to households, what will happen is that when the economy does begin to recover, they will be paying back their debts rather than spending. So the aggregate demand effect of people returning to work will be extremely attenuated, which will just drag out the recovery itself. Similarly, if small businesses are allowed to go bankrupt, then the growth in employment will take much, much longer to happen. Next slide. So just a couple of words about the debt. So in the US and in the UK, this is not a privilege that developing countries have, but in the United States, the government will sell bonds. It is easier, it is not as expensive because interest rates have been lowered substantially, and because there's still a perception that US bonds are safe. But at least in the United States, the Fed will be able to buy these bonds and so, in a certain sense, print money, if you will. And I think, again, this is a time for us to, as discussions about the Fed building up, basically buying up these bonds is challenged. I think we have to remind ourselves of a lot of research which tells us that that high levels of government debt are not catastrophic, in fact, are in fact the solution. But it does matter critically what the debt is spent on. Next slide. If you could skip this one, I think I'm running out of time, so let me, there we go. And one of the discussions that will happen, no doubt, is the issue of inflation. Inflation is a more complex issue to analyze right now. Oil prices have plummeted. And so that is a factor that will hold down inflation. But nevertheless, the decline in production at some point, at least in some industries, may lead to higher prices. And I think that this is an important moment for us to return to the tools of plans for rationing, as well as price controls as a way to address this. So in other words, this is something we need to be prepared for. And I have not yet seen any plans to address this, but I think it is a focus that we have to have so that we don't cut government spending in response to inflation. Next slide. And finally, I want to just suggest some other ways to reduce debt, apart from cutting oil subsidies, is to create the potential for a return on investment. So for example, the US government is funding some businesses, some pharma firms and biotech firms to research vaccines. If those vaccines then come with patents that then give monopoly rights to these firms, it means that the vaccine may not be widely available, or there will be exorbitant profits. And it really makes sense for the government to take an equity stake in firms that are developing vaccines. I think criminal justice reform is something that is a possibility. And in the United States, I was mentioning before we started that there are 38,000 prisoners have been released in the United States to reduce the spread of COVID, but the United States has over 2 million prisoners, and this is a moment for us to really think about criminal justice reform and the billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that we spend on this that could be spent otherwise. I think it's an opportunity to also talk about cutting the military budget, to restoring the pre-Trump tax rates, and as Diane mentioned, to impose some kinds of financial transactions tax as a way to fund this. So I want to just say this, there are ways to address the issue of debts and deficits. And we as progressive economists have had many ideas in the past, and I think it's an opportunity to bring those out again and to actually preempt the discussion around debt by raising these issues now. And finally, just a point about my own community in which the city government is thinking about cutting the budget in the city because of the loss of revenue. And what some of us are doing is meeting with city government to talk about restructuring the debt, to asking creditors, much as national governments do, for reduced interest rates and a debt-free grace period. I mean, if we are all in this together, there needs to be some shared sacrifice. And I'm hopeful that, that we can engage in that conversation and bring up some new ways of addressing this rather than old ways, which is austerity and return to the fractured world that COVID so readily found a host in. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So next we move to Jayati, and before we do, just a suggestion, Jayati does not have any slides, so viewers might want to turn on speaker view so we can see her better as she speaks. Okay, Jayati, please.
Well, thank you, Elissa, and thank you, Ayafi, to allow me to be part of this panel. It's terrific to hear both Diane and Stephanie come out with these very clear and comprehensive statements. I'm going to talk about a rather broad canvas, so forgive me if I'm a bit general to begin with, but it's really because I'm so struck, and in fact, I know you're going to say that this is naive, but I'm just so jealous of the fact that you actually have fiscal stimuli in your economies. Across most of the developing world, we are actually faced with more austerity. It's a little bit like what you were just saying, Stephanie, that, you know, in your community, the local government wants to actually cut spending because they have less income. This is happening across the developing world. At a time when economies have been administered the biggest blow, I would argue, that they have experienced in a century, we actually have governments adding to that blow. First of all, of course, by very, very harsh lockdown measures. It's interesting that the harshest lockdown measures have been in the developing world. India has the most draconian in the world, followed by Pakistan, but the rest are all developing countries. We have put in the most severe lockdown measures, most stringent, largely because I think governments feel that they simply don't have the capacity to cope if there is an increase in infection. So it's been extremely severe, and it has meant absolute devastation of the economies. Now, So there is a self-inflicted wound, if you like, which is driven by the pandemic, but is a very extreme and severe wound in terms of a complete cessation of all economic activity, demand and supply both, bam, right, completely smashed. But simultaneously, you then have this absolute perfect storm of terrible things coming from the international economy. So globally, what have developing countries faced? A dramatic decline in exports, almost a collapse in remittance incomes, zero money from tourism revenues, and a huge reversal in all capital flows. So there's been a massive flight back to safety, which means coming back to the US, basically, which has meant that pretty much all developing currencies have depreciated by between 10 to 30% in just 6 weeks. So this is the external force, which really means that all developing countries, except for a very privileged few, I'm leaving out China, Taiwan, China, etc. Most developing countries are facing a foreign exchange constraint, even when they didn't face it, even 6 weeks ago. Suddenly, all developing countries have a foreign exchange constraint. The ones who already had one are now in extreme difficulty, really very significant, where they don't even have enough reserves to meet, let's say, 1 month of worth of exports or 2 months worth of exports. So that's the first. The outcome of this, and I'm so glad both of you mentioned that we need to have international measures of solidarity, like an increase in the SDRs, which would provide some foreign exchange immediately to all countries, and a debt reduction. At the moment, African countries are paying more in debt servicing than they are paying for health expenditure. At the moment, across the developing world, governments are cutting health expenditure. I want to emphasize this point. We are cutting health expenditure at a time of COVID-19 because of the fact that there are these very, very severe constraints. Now, the budgetary constraints are partly, as I said, driven by the foreign exchange constraint, but partly they're also self-created. So my own country, India, I'm appalled to say, we have had a fiscal stimulus package, I hesitate to even call it that amounts to new spending of less than 0.5 percentage point of GDP. Less than 0.5 percentage point. Today, the government came out swinging in terms of announcing how much they had done for people who had lost their jobs and their livelihoods and are facing starvation. And they admitted that they had spent, well, I mean, they were bragging about it, but what they have spent, they said, affects less than 1/3 of the population and comes to 900 rupees per person. 900 rupees is about $1.20 over a 40-day period of complete lockdown. So we are talking about, $14 for the 40-day period. So we are talking about a complete collapse. Just to give you further examples of India, 95% of our workers are informal. That is no protection, nothing, no furlough, no paid leave, nothing of any kind. More than 140 million people are known to have lost their jobs. It's probably in the range of 200 million people have lost their jobs. The other 200 million have certainly lost their incomes for 40 days. We know that many of them are actually facing starvation. A survey of migrants, there are about 150 million migrants in the cities of India. A survey of migrants found that more than half of them had enough money for food for the next day, that's all, and no more. In this time, the government support has been hugely lacking. Now, some of it's true, India is possibly unusual in the complete lack of support and empathy, and I would say the callous cruelty of the government vis-a-vis most of the people. But this is not an unusual story. Across the developing world, we are facing this. And it's because of this fear of even the so-called stronger emerging markets. And today we had the finance ministry spokesman telling us this, that given our ratings, we cannot actually spend more. So it's the obsession with the rating agencies, the obsession with what will happen to capital flows, which will cause further depreciation, which will prevent governments from doing even the most basic things to shore up the economy, much less to improve the welfare of the people and of women in particular. Now, so therefore, we definitely need an increase in SDR. Am I still here?
Yes.
Okay, good, because suddenly the screen has gone. But anyway, we definitely need an increase in SDR. We definitely need debt cancellation and certainly a moratorium immediately on debt payments for the next 6 months. But we also need capital controls, because until we can do capital controls, our governments will never have the confidence to actually do minimum expenditure to actually combat this crisis, not to mention to do the minimum health spending that we need to cope with the pandemic. Now, in the absence of all this, what's exactly happening to women and what is likely to happen to women in the middle of all this? Definitely, we're going to get a decline in employment. I've already talked about what's happening in India, but this is happening across the board. And we know, Elissa has done a lot of great work on this. We know that when there are fewer jobs, women are much less likely to get them. They're definitely likely not to get the better jobs, but they're also, when there are fewer jobs altogether, they will be rationed out of even those. We are likely to see significant declines in pay, major increases in precarious work. The point I want to highlight is food insecurity. At least 500 million, maybe 2 billion people globally are actually facing major food insecurity. And this is even faced by those who are working in agriculture, many of whom cultivate cash crops. And the collapse in prices, but also the inability to access food because of the collapse in livelihoods, is actually a very major problem that is often ignored in the developed world, because in the developed world, the food insecurity is more a reflection of immediate livelihood issues and distribution, whereas in the developing world, it's actually complete collapse of the ability to buy food for a very, very significant part of the population. And finally, I think one aspect that is, again, relatively neglected is the neglect of other health issues, reproductive health in particular. Women's health issues have never been a big concern in the public spending of most developing countries, but reproductive health has always been one of the Cinderellas in terms of fiscal allocation. Now it's actually being actively pushed out. In India, we know that there are many more women who do not actually have hospital deliveries and are forced to deliver in very uncertain and unsafe conditions at home without qualified personnel to help them. We know that many more women are not getting basic illnesses treated, because all the medical attention, such as it is now concentrated on dealing with COVID or defining cases, isolating them, oppressing those who have them by terrible quarantine conditions and so on. So there is a real serious issue, the combination of inadequate past public health spending, reduced current health spending, and diversion of existing health spending to COVID-19 issues entirely has meant a dramatic decline in the other health conditions of people. So I just want to highlight this as, if you like, a particular sectoral implication of this macroeconomic mess that we are seeing. So as I mentioned, clearly there's a lot that we need to do within our own countries to generate enough demand and public opinion to force governments to change. But many governments don't have the choice, because of the fact that global finance has generated such a stranglehold on even very, very poor countries, very least developed countries, in terms of their ability to undertake minimal spending in the face of declining revenues. We have to change the global financial architecture. And in particular, we have to not just enable much more SDR resources and cancellation of debt and the flow of capital, and enable capital controls. But we must also request all of you in the developed world who recognize the need for a progressive and feminist response to all of what's going on, that any expansions, I mean, here you're talking about 10% of GDP, 12% of GDP. Okay, small ones are 5% of GDP. And you're talking about massive monetary expansion. I'm told the US Fed has already put out more than 30% of GDP. And you're talking about SDR allocations, which the developed world, which will get 84% of them, will not use. At least hand over your SDR allocations to poor countries when we have the allocations. At least make sure that, say, 5% or 2% of the increase in quantitative easing is allocated to developing countries for health spending. And particularly for not necessarily COVID only, but all the other health spending, like reproductive health issues, that is being ignored in the current pandemic. Okay, I'll stop here because I think we really need to have a discussion, so thanks.
Thank you, Jayati. So now we're going to progress to the Q&A and discussion. And to give you some guidelines, we're going to have a couple of minutes per comment or question. And I ask you to raise your hand by clicking on participants at the bottom of your screen and then raise hand. Jihi will be coordinating calling on people. We'll try to get to everyone, but if you are selected, your name will be called and you will be unmuted by Jihi at that moment. And we'll take a few comments at a time and then go back to the panel for response and discussion. If you have any issues with raising your hand in the participant mode, you can type your name, affiliation, and question to the host, Jihi, via the chat function, and Jihi will read out your question on your behalf. Okay, so let's pause here. Yes, Jihi.
Yeah, we have some hands raised already. So I'm gonna unmute you when I call on you. So our first question is gonna be from Jessica Woodruff. Go ahead, Jessica.
Hi, thank you very much for really interesting presentations. I just wanted to ask all the speakers whether this is perhaps an opportunity to promote a new understanding of the care economy in relation to the productive economy, and whether you could perhaps sort of say a bit more about how we might do that.
Okay, thank you.
Shall I take a couple at a time? So maybe the next question will be from Ella Hopkins. Ella, you can go ahead in 1 second. Just trying to unmute Ella. There we go.
Oh,
Please
has
go
that
ahead,
worked?
Ella.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your extremely informative presentations. I just wanted to ask a question around the international response. So we've seen, for example, discussions around SDR allocation and debt have really been kind of held back and mired in geopolitical discussions and maneuvering, especially on the G20 and through the IMF and World Bank boards. And obviously this demonstrates again how broken the international system is for kind of dealing with these questions, and more broadly, the sort of international decision-making mechanisms are for financing and development. So I wanted to ask, how do we effectively kind of shift power away from some of these institutions and elites towards a more inclusive, equitable, and rights-based decision-making body? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'll do a third question from Karen. Karen, you can go ahead.
Thank you. This is Karen, and my question fits really well with the question we had just before. As international feminist economists, how do we turn our really great analysis? We know so much about this crisis. How do we seize the moment and demand for what Stephanie said, you know, a different new economics, you know, with like the knowledge that we've been building for all these decades? I think it's a good moment, but how do we proceed? That's my question.
Okay, thank you. So we'll pause here and go back to the panel. I think all three of our panelists have a lot to say about these questions. So I'll start in reverse order with Jayati.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, look, let me begin with the whole, I think it was Ella's question about, you know, the global system is basically not going to handle it. It's not going to do it. It's not doing it. And we can see that, right? Here we all talk about solidarity and we're all in it together, but it turns out we're not, or at least our leaders don't think we are. And our leaders are all doing the worst possible kind of individualistic and nationalist kind of responses. So here's the thing, I don't think those are sustainable beyond a few months. I think if we do not do something serious on global debt, we are going to see a global debt crisis like nothing you have ever seen, okay? I mean, Argentina is a test case. If you do not get a resolution of the Argentine crisis, Argentina will have to go into default. Most of Africa, a large part of the developing world, will have to go into default because they have no choice. They simply cannot pay. They do not have foreign exchange to pay. And that is going to have the kind of ramifications that are unimaginable. Now, maybe it will take something as serious as that to actually focus people's minds and get serious attention into the kinds of things that we have been saying for a while. But I do not see how this current capitalist system, which is broken as we can see, can survive on the basis of ignoring both of these issues: the need for resources of developing countries, not just to fight the pandemic, but even to enable any kind of global recovery, and the need to avoid a massive debt explosion through moratorium and cancellation. On the care economy, I know that both Diane and Stephanie have so much to say about it. So I'm not going to say anything, except one point I just want to make, that, you know, in developing countries, even this pandemic has not made governments recognize the importance of care. And so you're thinking, you know, you're breaking your head on the wall saying, what will make them realize it? But even today, we are underpaying, undermining, and treating our basic frontline health workers horribly, okay? Assuming that there will be more women waiting to come and take those terribly low-paid, terrible jobs to do this unprotected work. So it's going to take more than even something like this, or maybe an even more devastating health crisis, before this, at least this message gets spread through in the developing world. This sounds terribly depressing. And I know that that's not what we want to hear, because we want to hear more, you know, good stuff about how we can generate a more positive thinking about this. But I think we have to recognize the reality that our governments are, in most of the developing world, are beyond patriarchal in terms of how they're approaching this particular crisis. And that without a much more dramatic raising of collective voices, which we haven't done, I think, enough, but a much more global raising of feminist voices of men and women, we cannot actually address even this basic, obvious point that care has got to be one of the basic new ways in which we restructure the economies of the future.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Thank you. So with regard to the issue about promoting sort of awareness of the care economy, you know, I liken the care economy and public discussions of it to those around eco-services, right? And that is that they're free, that they're limitless, and they're invisible. And, you know, I think this is a moment for those of us who are in a position to be able to do this, to really put on our public intellectual hat, to write op-eds, to communicate with legislators, to, you know, we're in a sense, we're in new territory in a vacuum. So people are seizing on ways to understand this crisis. So I think that people are increasingly aware of the fact that it is a lot of women on the front line, and it is women who are teleworking and taking care of the household and children. So I think raising the awareness around this is a good opportunity to highlight the care economy. I think there's probably more that can be done in that area, but let me just say that simply articulating what we have long known around care and how it's impacting this crisis is an enormous public service. And I encourage people to engage in public conversations, debates, op-eds, and so on and so forth. And with regard to, you know, there's a piece here that I haven't quite fully understood and want to think about more. This is in response in particular Karen's comment, and as well as Ella's comment about global debt and the global financial infrastructure. I mean, what's going on in Argentina right now is, once again, we have bond vigilantes who are holding Argentina hostage, right? This is, again, in moments of crises, it opens up a political space that did not previously exist. This is, you know, another place for us to begin to think about how to reform global, not only global financial markets, but even national financial markets and the outsized impact that bond markets have, for example, on government abilities to respond to debt. And I will say once again that, you know, that this is an opportunity for us as economists and progressive economists to make the case that that debt is not the problem, it is the solution right now, and that debt that is well spent, and that's not debt bailing out the oil industry or the airlines or some of these other organizations that have had tremendous benefits in the past, but debt that is targeted to particular groups, whether it's reproductive health, whatever the areas are, that debt is sustainable because it contributes to the productive capacity of the economy. In other words, fiscal space that is so often been minimized to be thought of as within a 1 year period of time really needs to be expanded to a longer range. And this is an opportunity for us to redefine how we think about these comments like fiscal space, these concepts like fiscal space, so that we can in fact have leverage in changing macroeconomic policy, policies around debt and so forth. That's it.
Thank you. Diane.
I think this moment does give us new opportunities to put the issue of care centrally in the agenda. In the UK, the huge rate of deaths in the residential care facilities for very frail elderly people, huge rate of deaths. And that has really brought to public attention the inadequacy of that care system at the moment, what we call social care. And I think there'll be a lot of appetite, public appetite for investment to improve those facilities, to bring it back into public ownership, because it's all outsourced at the moment, although some of the money for it comes from the public purse, to improve the terms and conditions of these workers that, usually they were low paid, low skilled, but suddenly now they're essential workers, and that gives us another opportunity, I think, for changing the way people think about this. In a more techie, nerdy space, in the Women's Budget Group, we've been talking for some time about investment in social infrastructure, how spending on care, whether it's for children, whether it's for frail elderly people, people with severe disabilities, is not current consumption, it's investment in social infrastructure, and it should have the same priority as investment in physical infrastructure. And in some countries, I think in the UK is one of them, maybe US another, there's been quite a lot of talk about New Deals, getting out of this mess that we're in now through a Green New Deal. And I'm in favor of a Green New Deal, but I think we need Care New Deal as well. So we have to make sure that investment in care is also seen as absolutely critical. I think there's a new opportunity to do that in some countries, because the crisis has exposed how threadbare the current provision is, and we're going to be campaigning for a national care system in the UK on parallel lines to the national health system. In terms of the international context, there's no easy answer, is there? I mean, it's trying to chip away here and there. It's trying to change the intellectual climate, but it's also trying to find other spaces. Maybe there are regional spaces where these issues can be also raised and dealt with, the regional development banks, for instance. Because at the moment there's a real logjam there. We're looking to you in the US, to elect somebody better than Trump at the next election. Maybe that will change a little bit of the logjam. Though I think Jayati's right about this is not a sustainable situation. This UN committee that I sit on, the Committee for Development Policy, is working at the moment on an ad hoc report, particularly to address the COVID-19 crisis from the point of view of the least developed countries, and definitely the issue of a new multilateral economic system will be on the agenda there. And we can all come up with bright ideas for that. I think Jayati's put some on the table. I mean, the issue is the politics of it. How do you move towards that? And it may be that we need a deeper crisis. The default issue, I think, that Jayati mentioned. And then how do we proceed to a new economics? Well, the way I'm trying to think about this, and we're trying to think about it in the UK, is kind of rejecting the notion, oh, well, we went down and now we want a sharp recovery back to some kind of normal, to what we were before, and saying, no, we don't want recovery, we want transformation, and then putting various ideas on the table in terms of policies and targets and objectives for something that's transformation, not recovery. Some people use the slogan, build back better. And then they have various ideas about how it should be better and how you might build it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Diane. Okay, I think we are going to go back to collect another few questions. Jihi?
Yes, so our first question will be from Marcella. Marcella, you can share your question. Right, go ahead.
Thank you, and hello to everybody, especially to my friends, of course. I just wanted to stress something that Diana just said, talking about the New Deal. You're probably aware, certainly Diana is, that we have been speaking quite a lot also together about a pink New Deal as a way out of the previous crisis. So of course, I would like to know in terms of green and pink and maybe purple New Deal, whether we can work together on such a proposal. But apart from that, I just wanted to share with you also some thought that came out of my lectures a few days ago. I was teaching the Asian crisis to my students on development finance. And I was really hit by the similarities of the contagion in the Asian crisis and what is experiencing now in our economies in terms of the contagion in the COVID-19. And it came quite natural to me to ask myself and also to my students, how is it possible that we don't learn from the mistakes that have been done in the past? So taking into account the fact that even at that time, we just thought that the problem was coming elsewhere. You know, the problem was there in Asia. You know, like this time we have thought that everything was there in China, and somehow we were really happy that something was happening over there that would allow our economies to grow more than in China. So this is the awful mistakes that we do every time. Instead of coming out all together, we try to take advantage of the mistakes or unfortunately, the damages that have been done somewhere else. So can we work all together in sisterhood to help this system to grow up in more solidarity and sisterhood, of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcella.
Now our next question will be from Patricia. Patricia, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the panel and for the International Association for Feminist Economics for opening this space. It was really great. I'm enjoying the conversation, actually. Well, the issue I want to bring in is the following. Well, this situation of the COVID has destroyed a good part of the local economies around the world. Actually, I'm living now in Mexico, and I can tell. But I also have friends, and well, my roots are in Spain, so I can know a little about the situation there as well. And well, there have been companies that have laid off workers during this pandemic, and we have to add to those people who did not have enough savings. So in short, people have, or some of them have been forced to apply for loans to be able to eat, pay for the rent. And on top of that, we have this big drop in the prices of the oil barrel. So in this context, of course, some governments are aware that they need money to finance the climate change agenda, to finance a necessary agenda to recover a certain state of welfare and public services like health, education, care, etc. And from the financial world, some proposals arise, and I have read some of them, and I want to ask about your reflections on these proposals, specifically one that is called eternal debt, not external, but eternal. And the other one is perpetual bonds. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then our third comment will be from Rosalie. Rosalie, please go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for this great conversation. I also believe that we have, as I've heard Jayati say, Stephanie say, and Diane say as well, you know, we have enlightened opinions, specialized analytic abilities to talk about this current situation. And I feel as though we could perhaps take some more concrete steps to support the members of this group in lifting their voices, having their voices be heard. Stephanie talked about that it's a good time to put on our public scholar hats, to write the op-eds, to write the opinions. And this, I would say, is not a small challenge because it's such a cacophony out there. So I wanted to propose perhaps like an op-ed writing group or some way we can support the members of this group to get together and to start writing and speaking in ways that are modern and effective. I know we have our scholarly and our academic journal, and that's really important research and work, but I feel like there's another piece that we could, all of us in this group, be doing, which is to start talking in a way where more people are listening. So that's my proposal, and I put it out there, and hopefully we can move forward and do something with that. More voices.
Thank you. Okay, so let's start with Stephanie this time.
Okay. So just to maybe start with Marcella, I think, you know, I've been doing a lot of teaching and talking about the Green New Deal, but, you know, there is the Purple New Deal that others have proposed around the care economy. And I think an actually important project for us as feminist economists, if we're going to engage publicly, is to merge those two into a robust policy platform or ideas that will enlarge the scope of people's understanding of what actually can be done. I also wanted to challenge you, Marcella, not in a you know, critical way, really, to say that why haven't we learned from the last crises? We have, right? We have. And the problem has been the power structure. All of our efforts to deal with the behavior of the financial sector in response to the Great Recession came to naught. So in some ways, I think that at least for me, it's important to think strategically and politically at this point about how to move us in an alternative direction. And there are many good ideas out there. And so, for example, you know, I think one way to frame this for us is in thinking about going forward is that it's a notion of building resilience in our societies and our economies that rely on co-insurance. So it's about shifting the discussion from individualistic endeavors to co-insurance. And we are at a moment politically in which people get the fact that we are in this together, that none of us is actually isolated. And so I think there are ways for us to frame this in a way that can be more accessible to the public. And I really love Rosalie's idea of an op-ed workshop. I think, you know, starting from the statement that IAFI came out with as sort of a, you know, kind of a framing for doing that, I think that would be great.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, how about Diane next?
Well, let me start with a confession of ignorance. I'm not, Patricia asked about perpetual bonds and eternal debt. This is not something I've looked into at all. I don't know whether the other people on the panel have. I know that George Soros had an op-ed saying, you know, we should go for perpetual bonds, which I think, you know, is bonds that are just always there. You don't ever redeem them. But of course, in some ways, debt always gets rolled over. It never gets paid off. So I'm not totally sure what the differences are between long-term bonds and perpetual bonds. But if anybody else can enlighten us on that, I'd be very, very keen to hear more on that. I think about the ways that we need to work to construct solidarities and to engage with broader publics there are some international things we can do, and I think these IAFI webinars is very a very good initiative. I know that UN Women is in the process of starting work on a new report, really on this kind of building back better. How can we have a better recovery from this? But I also think we each have to work where we are, because the contexts are different in each of our countries, and the opportunities that we have are different. So at the moment, in terms of working more broadly, more politically, the work I do is with the Women's Budget Group, which produces short briefing papers, what you would call op-eds, pieces in blogs and so forth, that tries to both inform the broader women's movement about these issues, and also try to influence the media, try to get the message through to those MPs, members of parliament, that are likely to be more sympathetic to this, to influence the way that the Labour Party, the opposition parties, developing its policies. So I do think the whole range of things that we can and should be doing outside the academy, but the opportunities that we have to do that and the type of activity it needs to be will also be dependent on the specific context in which we are.
Okay, thank you, Diane. Jayati.
Did we lose Jayati?
She has to be unmuted, I think.
No, I think she's just frozen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe we can come back and do some questions.
That
Okay,
sounds good.
great. So our next question will be from Blarina. Blarina, please go ahead.
Oh. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Yes, thank you for the very good discussions. My question actually is about considering the actual situation of men and women in the pandemic, especially of women. Do you think that the measures undertaken from the local governments are more a result of like gender blind analysis of the situation? And if so, do you think we can make like a recommendation for the governments to use gender responsive budgeting as a tool to make budgets more responsible, and therefore not only the responses to the pandemic, but also the responses to the aftermath more gender responsible? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, and our next will be from Luis. Luis, please go ahead.
I have a question following up from my colleague, Ella, on the international financial architecture, and related to Jayati's comment and Diane's comment about the powerful effect that the debt crisis could have. And I'm wondering, I've been having these discussions, unsurprisingly, given that I work with the Bretton Woods Project, on the implications of an SDR increase on the embedding further developing countries within the IMF and World Bank frameworks. Same thing with, for example, a debt moratorium by the bank. And I'm wondering, so I've been having these discussions with some people around a willful default by a number of countries on their debt. So without waiting for a debt restructuring, but take a decision, as eventually Argentina did in 2001, to default on their debts to put pressure on the system. But then of course, there's this great discussion about what happens next. And I'd really appreciate your thoughts on how, if this were to happen, what are some ways that these countries or combinations of countries could organize themselves in mutual support to weather the storm that would surely come, and whether you think any of this is a potential, holds any potential at all to pressure for system change. Thank you.
Great, and our next question will be from Katie. Katie.
Oh, hi folks.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. I suppose my question is connected also into the conversations we're having about New Deals. I'm involved with Green New Deal UK, and there's a plan in works for launching a campaign with frontline care workers next week, connecting that sort of care New Deal with climate justice and building back better. I struggle though with the nation-focused model that a lot of these campaigns necessarily take, and I wanted to hear from the speakers what they think about where the site of struggle is to build a more internationalized approach, because there's no such thing as a nation level New Deal for these challenges. And so, yeah, I suppose like where is the site of struggle? Where do we need to take that, and how do we organize?
Thank you. We have a number of hands raised. I don't think we're going to get to everyone, but I'm going to add 2 more comments to this round just so we have a little bit more. So next we'll hear from Mariama Williams. Please go ahead.
So, hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes.
Hello. It's been a really sterling panel, and I'm really enjoying the discussions. I won't belabor the point because I think all the points that I think are critical have been made. I wanted to flag one other thing. I hate to be a doom and gloom person, but in addition to the points that were made about the dearth of fiscal policy possibilities in many developing countries, the overhang of debt, there's one other kind of sword that's hanging over many developing countries, which is the fact that given the COVID lockdown, the economic condition that business operate under in many developing countries, and I mean foreign investors, have changed significantly. And so many governments are now very much afraid that the businesses will be suing them under the investment treaty agreement. And so there's a great deal of concern that many of these firms will be suing on the basis of lost profit because the governments have mandated lockdown that has changed their terms of business. And we already know that they've brought quite egregious cases before the International Tribunal that have cost poor countries even more money than they receive in ODA. So apart from the debt, there's also this really tremendous sword that's hanging over many countries in terms of what can they do. So there has been a call by many economists to ask for a moratorium on these. They're called investor state dispute settlement mechanism, led by including the independent expert on debt, Jeffrey Sachs and others. So I think that's one of the things we need to flag also. I think the G20 has said that they're asking for a standstill on debt services or debt moratorium for the poorest countries. And the poorest countries certainly do need it, but I must tell you that the middle income countries in Latin America, in the Caribbean, are at really desperate stage. We are already in crisis and in debt distress, severely so, before this. And so that also adds to that. So I think we need to also flag really corporations, many TNCs are beginning to think, and they're being encouraged by legal firms, that they may have cases under various investor state treaty to be able to try to get claw back profits that they had not realized, depending on how long this goes on. So that's a tremendous thing that will have implications for healthcare, food security, water, sanitation, fuel, energy, all of the various things that are critical for women's and men's lives and children in the developing countries. So I just want to put one more thing out there.
Thank you, Mariam.
Thank you. So shall we do one final comment from Bola Akanji? Bola, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Is Jayati back?
Yeah,
yes.
I'm back. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we lost you for a minute because
I know my internet connection died, but
okay.
it revived again. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Because I think my comments would relate more to Jayati's presentation because your focus is on developing countries. And as we can see now, the problems are really quite different, between the Western economies and the developing countries. And then secondly, because there is this lag between the prevalence of this COVID in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, we're having a kind of a lag in the Southern Hemisphere. It's like the height of the prevalence is still coming. Thirdly, the pattern of this COVID and the virus is set is posited to be to take a kind of W shape going into the future, a W curve going into the future. That means it's going to be coming in waves, peaks and troughs, peaks and troughs. So I'm looking beyond the current phase of this infection and beginning to wonder, one, the countries of the Southern Hemisphere now need to learn things from countries of the Northern Hemisphere. And the countries of the Northern Hemisphere that are in the midst of the crisis now are countries like India, and so on. So we should be thinking of learning at this point in time in anticipation of the height of the wave. But secondly, because post-COVID, or say post the first wave, we're going to have, like we all realize, there will be limited fiscal space to address the problems that have evolved. So what should women's groups be thinking of in terms of catching opportunities that are likely to arise, or rather to address the limitations that are going to arise for women in a post-COVID employment regime, where business models will change, modes of employment will change, a lot of coping strategies now will turn into permanent systems, that people like, we are dealing virtually now. There'll be a lot of that. There'll be a lot of communication that will no longer be physical. Women are already disadvantaged in terms of their capacity to function in the employment sector. They are going to be further disadvantaged when these employment models change post-COVID. And so even during the troughs of the infection, women may sink lower into poverty unless there is some coalition of countries or interests, women's interests in the global south or in the developing countries, to seize some spaces of opportunity. What are the issues that women's groups should be hammering on now? What are the spaces of limitation of women that will make them fall deeper, even during the troughs of the pandemic, or that can strengthen them to come up stronger in the next peak, to flatten their peaks in the next bout of the pandemic, especially looking at the informal sector economies, and then also looking at the social protection possibilities in the different countries.
Thank you. So a lot of big questions facing the panel. I also want to say before we turn to your responses that we're at the end of our time. We'll go over, but these will also be your sort of closing comments or responses. And I'll start with Jayati.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sorry I lost my connection in between. And so I think I missed Louise's comment, and I felt she was actually saying something a bit important, but unfortunately I only got to the end of it. So I'm sorry, Louise, if I do not take into account what you were saying. But these are very big. Mariama, you're absolutely right. On top of everything else, we've got these damn investment treaties, right? I mean, which are a killer, and which they inevitably use in the most obscene ways and in the worst times. And you're absolutely right that there is a real possibility. But remember, these are actually treaties that a number of developing countries actually decided to opt out of in the last 4 or 5 years. I think there were 12 African countries, 8 Latin American countries that first of all moved out of ICSID, and then secondly actually opted out of a whole lot of their bilateral investment treaties. So it's possible to have a larger coalition that says these are ridiculous and we will not accept them, I think, and especially at a time like this. I also, this was a very big set of questions that was raised at the end about how we build a broad coalition to actually think of a new way of doing things. But I think it's impossible to think of a completely new way. But I just want to make 2 broad points. One is that it is absolutely right that what we're going to move into is a whole different thing. I mean, we're definitely not in Kansas anymore. Yeah, it's an entirely different economic context that we're going to be facing, and I think that also provides opportunity. because I don't think global capital actually knows what's coming either. And I think global capital, if I may be frank among friends, is also scared shitless, right, at this point. And therefore, while they will certainly try to do all the different kinds of exploitative and terrible things that they are used to doing, they will also be worried at the possible sustainability of this. And we have to remember that this is really just, if you like, the first course. The main course is yet to come, which is climate change, which has started to come, but we haven't really seen the full extent of its ugly head yet. So all of that, I think, does create among global capital a greater receptivity to certain things which it would earlier, I think, force down with a terrible iron hand. And that is also true of many of our governments, which are turning more authoritarian and trying to use this opportunity for more control, surveillance, monitoring, and being generally appalling and bashing on human rights than they had in the past. But we are entering uncharted territory. Having said a lot of the very, very depressing things, we have to remember that there are some societies that have still managed to deal with this in a relatively impressive way. And it's very interesting that all of them are broadly socialist or left oriented, and all of them have had very strong public health systems. I'm thinking of Cuba, I'm thinking of Vietnam, I'm thinking of the Indian state of Kerala, which is the one shining example in an otherwise horrific scenario. And so it is possible to take from those examples attitudes towards public health, towards care, towards a broader pattern of thinking about solidarity and about community and about how you plan your economies and how you try and organize them relative to people and extend those in broader coalitions. So I think the very fact that they have been able to survive this so much more effectively and efficiently is already something that we can use in our broader discussions in terms of, you know, the way forward and how we address that way forward. There was one other point that I wanted to make, which I have now forgotten. So let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Jayati. Now we'll turn to Stephanie.
All right. So I'm going to sort of indirectly answer some of these questions. You know, I think that one of the issues that really is in front of us right now is redefining the role of the state. Many of us have been trying to move us in a more progressive direction, but one of the things that is extraordinary about human beings is how adaptable we are and how all of a sudden a universal basic income, at least in the United States, was passed by a very conservative Senate and a progressive House of Representatives. So I think that redefining that role is something that is our job right now, to articulate what that new role is. I want to just go on to this discussion Katie had mentioned about the Green New Deal. I mean, I think that the work on climate change is the opening for cross-national cooperation on a Green New Deal. And I would just say that that framework in many ways already exists, and we need to build on that. With regard to Mariama's comment about investors suing governments, you know, in the United States recently, the Senate wanted to pass a bill that would bar anyone from suing companies that forced workers to come to work and COVID or died from COVID. So there's this notion of, you know, and this is what always happens with the powerful, is that they try to protect themselves from damage and redistribute the burden to others. And again, I think this notion of co-insurance and shared burden is a way to frame a response to this. So yes, I see all of that coming, Mariama, and I think that we need to understand what's motivating it and to frame it in a different way. I mean, we can come up with policy solutions, but we have to really actually frame things in a very different way. And, you know, I've been long one of those economists who have argued that moral arguments, let's say for gender equality, don't work. I actually think in a moment like this, a return to morality and moral arguments can be very powerful and appropriately so. I just want to close on a note on debt. I think that debt is where we need to do some more work and some more thinking about this. I mean, with regard to the previous Patricia's comment about perpetual bonds and so forth, it just reminds me of indentured servitude, which is exactly what we have. whether it is low-income people in rich countries or poor countries indebted to large financial institutions. And I just want to call your attention to an article that was written by James Hines and Radhika Balakrishnan called Debt, Power, and Crisis: Social Stratification and Inequitable Governance of Financial Markets, in which they argue, in which they explore this issue of power and crisis and debt that I think is relevant to us today. And they conclude with a consideration of how economic and social rights provide an alternative framework for financial governance. I think that, you know, a lot of change in the world comes from being politically strategic as to when to really push on something. And I think this is a particular moment to do that. But I also think that it's really a moment for us to dig into the issue around debt and reframe traditional thinking about debt. And I'm hopeful that we can all do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. And now Diane.
Marina asked about gender responsive budgeting, and I think if it's done in the right way, it could be very helpful. What we've done in the UK in the Women's Budget Group is to look at this packages that the government has produced and say who benefits from it, who doesn't. Do women benefit? If so, which women? How does that compare with how much is going to companies? What we haven't tried to do, and what I think would be a big mistake, would be to say, okay, they're spending 4% of GDP on this. What percentage of that is going to women and what percentage of that is going to men? I don't think that's a helpful way to approach this, but I do think looking both at the way the crisis is had an impact on the economy and the kind of measures that have been introduced from a gender equality perspective helps us to identify where things need to change. So I'd certainly encourage people to be doing that. Louise asked about coordinated default, and I seem to remember in the past this is also discussed, and I know one of the problems was what impact this has on your trade credits. So you might default on your debts, but then nobody might give you trade credit. So you can't import any medicine in the after 3 months after you've used up your foreign reserves. So on the one hand, it's an idea that maybe some people are exploring, but I think there are big limits to this in terms of the knock-on effect it has onto trade credit, which are really going to constrict what you can import in terms of essential medicines, for instance. I do think this is a moment for mutuality. I think that's the word we're using a lot in the UK. There has been a blossoming of very localized mutual help organizations. Somebody will send me an email saying, you know, you're over 70, so you're meant to, do you need somebody, you're not meant to go to the supermarket, do you need somebody to do some shopping for you? So there's a lot of mutuality, and I think there is a lot of rebirth of the belief that we need a strong welfare state after decades when this had been under attack. And I think that's an important resource for us to build on, because it's also building a different kind of state that's not a kind of top-down state, but is going to be built more from the bottom up, and there's going to be built on principles. You called it co-insurance, Stephanie. I think we're talking about the same thing here. We use the phrase mutuality, and it's that possibility that gives me some cause for optimism on some days, and on other days I just feel very very depressed, particularly in terms of the way that this crisis is not yet weakened international financial interests. And the financialization has in some ways been strengthened by this, because in countries that have got fiscal and monetary packages to deal with, there's a huge reliance on the commercial banks and other financial institutions to develop it and strengthening their position in some ways. And I do think we have to put our heads together on, if you like, the definancialization. How can we work more on the definancialization of the world economy?
Thank you, Diane. We are significantly over time. I know that there are a number of questions that we haven't gotten to, but I would invite folks who didn't get to ask their question to post them on the IAFI listserv or email the speaker directly, preferably on the listserv, because it would be really interesting to engage everyone with that. And I also want to close with thanking the speakers so much for a really stimulating conversation. We'll be sending an email out with information how to get the recording, information on future events. And as James mentioned at the beginning, our next event is at the same time on May 22nd, focusing on COVID and feminist political economy. Thank you, everyone. Does James or Jihi, do you want to say anything to close?
Nope, I think that's it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.